Imagine witnessing a police officer shove your mother to the ground for no reason. Now, picture being the one person who could single-handedly end his career. It was an ordinary afternoon at Greenwood Plaza, the kind of place where people momentarily escape their daily grind. The air carried the warm scent of fresh pretzels, bright lights flickered overhead, and the hum of conversation filled the space. Parents tugged at their restless children, while groups of teenagers loitered by the food court, sharing laughter and inside jokes. Among the crowd was Eleanor James, 68 years old, soft-spoken yet resolute when it counted. She wasn't on a grand shopping spree, just a quick stop at JCPenney for a few essentials, a cozy sweater, some socks, and a small gift for her granddaughter. With slow but deliberate steps, she moved through the mall, her gray curls peeking out from beneath a knitted hat. She had witnessed a lot in her lifetime, but never did she expect her name to be splashed across headlines by the day's end. As she exited the store, raised voices caught her attention. Just a few feet away, at the Foot Locker checkout counter, a young man, no older than his early 20s, was locked in an argument with the cashier. His words tumbled out in frustration, hands gesturing rapidly as he attempted to explain himself. The employee, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, looked uneasy, her eyes darting toward the security desk, shifting nervously on her feet. She was unsure of what to do next. Miss James had never been the type to interfere in strangers' affairs, but something about this moment felt different. There was a tension in the air, thick and unspoken. She could hear the tremor in the cashier's voice as she struggled to respond, the way the young man's fists clenched, not in anger, but in sheer exasperation. For a second, she considered walking away. But then, the girl's voice cracked as she whispered, I don't want any trouble. And that was all it took. Miss James took a step forward. Her voice, though gentle, carried weight. Son, take a breath, she said, steady and calm. Tell her what's wrong. The young man turned toward her, startled. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his face flushed with frustration. She thinks my card is fake. Daniels, he didn't disappoint. His patience snapped like a rubber band stretched too thin. His hand shot forward fast, a blur of movement, and then crack. His fist connected with M. James's face. A sickening sound echoed through the store. She stumbled backward, legs giving out beneath her, the world around her spun as her body hit the cold tile floor. Gasps, screams, a woman yelled, oh my God. A man's voice cut through the chaos. Did he just punch her? Miss James lay there, her cheek burning, her vision blurred. She touched her face, feeling the sting of raw skin. Her glasses knocked off to the side, but she barely had time to process what just happened, because Daniels was on her knees on the ground, hands grabbing at her arms. Stop resisting, he barked. Resisting? She wasn't resisting, she was barely conscious, but that didn't stop him. A knee pressed against her back, the weight of him crushing her small frame. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore, they were yelling. A man stepped forward, phone in his hand. Get off her, a woman was crying. Check, an old lady, what are you doing? The boy from the register, his face red with anger, tried to move closer. Man, what the hell is wrong with you? Daniels didn't care. His hand gripped Miss James's wrist, twisting it behind her back. He reached for his cuffs, ready to make an example out of her, and that's when it happened. A voice, deep, commanding, unmistakable, get your hands off my mother. And just like that, the entire energy in the room changed the moment that voice cut through the chaos. Everything froze. Officer Daniels's grip loosened. For just a second, the weight of his knee still pressing into Miss James's back. But now his face changed. It was the first sign of hesitation he had shown since this whole thing started. Like something inside him had just clicked, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. The crowd parted like water, making way for a storm, and there he was, Malcolm James, tall, broad shoulders, a suit that looked like it cost more than Daniel's entire paycheck. He wasn't just a man, he was a presence, and behind him two other men, just as sharply dressed, their faces cold and Unreadable Daniels didn't know them, but the way the crowd suddenly shifted, the way the whispers turned into recognition, told him they did, and that was the second time fear crept into Daniels' face. But Malcolm, he wasn't looking at him, he was looking at his mother lying on the ground, face bruised, struggling to breathe under the weight of a man who had no business touching her. His jaw tightened. "I said, get your hands off my mother." Daniels blinked, snapping back into his arrogance. He hated being challenged, hated feeling like he wasn't in control. She resisted arrest. He spat, gripping Miss James's wrist tighter, trying to prove a point. Malcolm took another step forward, and that's when Daniels realized just how tall he was. But Malcolm didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was low, firm, and laced with. Daniels didn't disappoint. His patience snapped like a frayed wire under too much pressure. His hand shot out, a blur of movement. Crack. His fist connected with Miss James's face. The sickening sound echoed through the store. She reeled backward, her legs buckling beneath her. The world tilted, spinning in chaos as her body hit the cold tile floor. Gasps. Screams. A woman's voice, shrill with shock. "Oh my God!" A man's voice, cutting through the noise. "Did he just punch her?" Miss James lay there, her cheek throbbing, vision swimming. She lifted a trembling hand to her face, feeling the sting of raw skin. Her glasses lay off to the side, knocked away in the impact. But there was no time to process the pain, because Daniels was on her, knees pressing into her back, hands seizing her arms. "Stop resisting," he barked. Resisting? She wasn't resisting. She could barely move, barely breathe, yet the weight of him crushed down, forcing her small frame against the ground. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were yelling. A man stepped forward, phone raised. "Get off her," a woman sobbed. "She's an old lady. What the hell are you doing?" The young man from the register was flushed with rage, his fists clenched. "Man, what the hell is wrong with you?" Daniels didn't care. His grip tightened around Miss James's wrist, twisting it behind her back. He reached for his cuffs, ready to make an example out of her. And then it happened. A voice. Deep. Commanding. Unmistakable. "Get your hands off my mother." Everything froze. The energy in the store shifted in an instant. Daniels hesitated, just for a second, his grip loosening ever so slightly. His knee still pressed into Miss James's back, but now his face changed. For the first time since this started, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Doubt. The crowd parted like water before a storm. And there he was. Malcolm James. Tall. Broad shoulders. A suit that probably cost more than Daniels made in a year. He wasn't just a man, he was a presence. And behind him, two more men, just as sharply dressed. Their expressions unreadable. Their posture unreadable. Daniels didn't know them. But the crowd did. The murmurs changed, turning from shock to recognition. And that was the second time fear crept into Officer Daniels. Daniels's face flickered, just for a moment, but Malcolm wasn't even looking at him. His eyes were locked on his mother, lying there, face bruised, struggling to breathe under the weight of a man who had no business touching her. Malcolm's jaw clenched. "I said, get your hands off my mother." Daniels blinked, snapping back into his arrogance. He hated being challenged, hated the feeling of losing control. "She resisted arrest," he spat, his grip tightening around Miss James's wrist, as if doubling down would prove a point. Malcolm took another step forward. And that's when Daniels realized. Malcolm was tall, looming. But he didn't need to shout. He didn't need to raise his voice. It was low, steady, laced with the kind of power that made men like Daniels nervous. "Let her go." Daniels hesitated. And that's when one of the men behind Malcolm spoke for the first time. This is the part where you stop digging your own grave, officer. Daniels turned, eyes narrowing. The man pulled out a badge. DOJ. Civil Rights Division. Daniels's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a bad moment caught on camera. This was a career-ending mistake. His breath hitched, but he tried to play it off. His grip on Miss James loosened, but not enough. His pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. His brain scrambled. Could he talk his way out of this? Could he spin it? But Malcolm. He was done waiting. He crouched beside his mother, his presence eclipsing Daniels entirely, like he didn't even exist. "Mom," he said softly, a stark contrast to the rage burning in his eyes. "Are you okay?" Miss James winced, her cheek already beginning to swell. Her body trembled, not just from pain, but from the weight of what had just happened. "I'm okay, baby," she whispered. But everyone could see she wasn't. Malcolm's jaw clenched. His fists curled. But he didn't lash out. He didn't need to. Because the DOJ official behind him wasn't playing games. His voice was steady, unyielding. "Officer Daniels." A pause. Step away from her. Now, Daniels finally let go. His knee lifted off Miss James's back, and for the first time, she could breathe. Malcolm was at her side instantly, his hands steady, careful as he helped her sit up. The entire mall was dead silent. Daniels stood there, his mind racing, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could feel the weight of it, the eyes, the cameras, the undeniable truth of what he had just done. And then, "Daniels." A voice cut through the stillness. "Officer Blake." She had been standing nearby, watching this entire thing unfold, frozen in stunned silence. But now, she finally stepped forward, her voice tight with disbelief. "What the hell did you just do?" Daniels turned to glare at her, his expression daring her to challenge him. But she wasn't backing him up. Not this time. Because even she knew, this wasn't defendable. One of the DOJ officials turned to Malcolm. "We saw everything," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no room for doubt. "And we already contacted Internal Affairs. Your mother is going to get justice." Daniels's stomach sank. His entire career flashed before his eyes. The lawsuits, the investigations, the fact that his face was now all over social media. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because Malcolm, calm, calculated Malcolm, slowly stood up. And then he spoke. "Justice." His voice was steady, but the fire in his eyes burned hotter than ever. "Oh no. This isn't just about justice." He stepped closer. "This is about making sure he never does this to anyone else again." Daniels knew, in that moment, his life would never be the same. But what happened next? That's what sealed his fate. The weight of Malcolm's words settled over the mall like a storm cloud. Daniels's face drained of color. His hands twitched at his sides. But for once, he had nothing to say. And the crowd? They weren't letting this go. Phones were still up. People were live streaming. News outlets were already being tagged. This wasn't just a bad day for Daniels. This was the end of him. Miss James was finally helped to her feet. Her body unsteady, but her gaze? Unbreakable. She had survived Jim Crow. She had survived redlining. She had survived marches where men spat in her face for simply existing. She had survived worse than men like Daniels. And now, the entire country was about to see exactly who he was. Malcolm's gaze never left Daniels. "You thought she was just another old black woman you could intimidate," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the air like a blade. "You didn't think twice before putting your hands on her because you've gotten away with this before." Daniels's throat bobbed. But still, he stayed silent. Malcolm took a step closer. "But this time, you picked the wrong one." The DOJ official turned to Officer Blake. "Officer, you need to take his badge." Blake hesitated. She had known Daniels for years. They had worked together, shared shifts, grabbed coffee between calls. But as she looked at him now, she didn't see a cop. She saw a coward. Without a word, she reached forward, unclipped his badge. Daniels flinched, like the metal had been ripped from his skin. It was over. Mall security escorted him away, not in handcuffs. But it didn't matter, because this was only the beginning of his downfall. By the time Miss James was in an ambulance, Malcolm at her side, the video was everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Twitter, Facebook. Racist cop attacks elderly black woman in mall. Her son's response leaves him speechless. The mayor released a statement within hours. Officer Daniels has been placed on unpaid leave pending a full investigation. But people knew what that meant. It meant they were scrambling, trying to control the damage. Too late. The country had already decided. Within 48 hours, the police department issued a press release. Daniels fired. But Malcolm, he wasn't done. Firing him isn't enough, he told reporters. He needs to face charges. And with the DOJ involved, it was only a matter of time. Miss James sat in her hospital bed, bruises fading, but her spirit unshaken. She looked at her son, her voice soft. "You didn't have to do all that, baby." Malcolm shook his head. "Ma, I did what any son would do." She smiled, squeezed his hand. "No, son. You did what every person should do." Her voice, quiet, but firm. "Stand up. Speak out. Never stay silent. Because silence, that's how they get away with it." She exhaled, looking out the hospital window. How many times have we seen this happen? How many times have we watched the same story play out? She turned back to her son. "It's time to demand more. Speak up. Record. Hold them accountable. Because if we don't..." Her eyes didn't waver. "Who will?"